What's up everyone, Chris from Full Steam Designs. Today I'm going to be making this epoxy sign. I'll be doing some work with the CNC router, and of course pouring a whole bunch of epoxy. The base for this sign is going to be MDF. It's easy to machine, the availability is good, and even with the crazy prices of material, it's still relatively inexpensive. I'll be referencing the top of the material for all of my tool paths except for the final cut. So I started by zeroing my first bit there. I'm using Carveco Maker Plus for this project, but it could be done with Maker or other programs. You can see I have all my tool paths designed here, and I'm going to start with this one that's called Background White. Basically what I'm doing is cutting out a 1/4 inch deep pocket that goes all the way to the outside border of the design. You could do each part of the design individually, but I think this is a better way to go. It will end up using a little extra epoxy, however. I'm using a 1/4 inch diameter bit and have my feed rate set to 100 inch per minute, but I ended up turning this up to 200% while it was running. You could probably go even faster if you wanted, depending on the rigidity of your machine. I ended up doing this cut in 2 passes. Once the pocket is finished, I used a bit of sandpaper to knock down any loose fibers off the edge, and a vacuum to get rid of any dust. You want this to be as clean as possible. It's a good idea to seal your base material. This will help prevent any bubbles and seal in any dust that you might have missed. I like using shellac because it dries fast. Within minutes, I was able to start pouring. For the epoxy, I'm using some Total Boat high performance resin and slow hardener. This gets mixed in a 2-to-1 ratio. That's 2 parts of resin to every 1 part of hardener. That's why the bottles are different sizes. For a successful epoxy pour, I found it's key to make sure your ratios are right, and that you properly mix everything. I scrape the sides of the container from time to time just to make sure everything is getting mixed in. For the white background, I want something really solid, so I'm just using white acrylic craft paint. I should be using a larger container, but this is all I had at the time. If you need to mix up multiple batches, make sure you're always adding the same amount of your color, otherwise it could look slightly different. I ended up needing 4 of these containers to completely fill the pocket. It's best to overfill the area. As the epoxy cures, it will shrink a little. Also, if there's any junk in the pocket, or your garage is dusty, all of that stuff will settle at the top and get machined off later. I made a few passes with a propane torch to get rid of any bubbles. In a few hours, it was solid. Cure times will vary based off the thickness of your pour, temperature, and the type of epoxy you use. The next machining operation is going to be 3 separate tool paths. I use the same 1/4 inch end mill to cut a deep channel around the perimeter of the sign. My material is roughly 3/4 of an inch thick. This channel is 0.6 inches deep, which will give the sign the appearance that it is completely made of epoxy and leave a nice finished edge. For the logo, I chose to do a 0.1 inch deep v-carve. This requires the use of a 60-degree V-bit, and once again, the same 1/4 inch end mill. That's the bit I started with. It will remove material wherever it can fit. Once it's finished, the machine will stop and allow me to do a bit change. Because I use these collars on my bits to set them all to the same length, I won't have to reset my Z0. This saves a lot of time and has proven to be very reliable. I have a video about these collars and the tool I use to set them up. I'll put a link in the description to that and some of the other tools and materials I used in this video. Epoxy likes to be cut fast. I like to keep my feed rates up around 100 inches per minute and the router speed low. I usually adjust this by ear as it's running. A small brush will help remove any leftover chips. The process for mixing the epoxy is the same, but this time I use some black diamond pigment. I mixed this in pretty heavy so the colors would be nice and solid. These squeegees from the dollar store work great for spreading the epoxy and getting it to fill all of the voids. I thought I had enough, but like I said before, it has a tendency to shrink down, so I added a little bit more that night. I wanted to add a little color to my logo, so I added a waving US flag to the background. I really only used a handful of bits on this project. A 1/4 inch end mill and or a 60-degree V-bit was used for all of the pocket operations. For the blue, I used a mixture of deep blue sea and iridescent blue. Once that cured, I came back and cut out the red stripes. Carveco will allow you to select what order you want the bits to be used in for these V-carves. While I do find that I get a better finish when I do the V-bit first, I really don't worry about it when I'm filling the pockets with epoxy. I just use whatever bit is already set up in the router. For the red stripes, I used a mixture of gold orange and scarlet. This next step is my favorite one, surfacing everything down and revealing the design. Up until this point, it looks pretty messy. For this step, I use a 1 1/4 inch surfacing bit. I don't have a stop collar set up on this bit, so this was the first time I had to reset my Z0. Surfacing will create a ton of chips. Initially, I thought it was too much for my dust boot to handle. I removed it and cleaned it out a couple times, but it just kept happening. I ended up shutting the dust collection off. When I went to clean up the mess later, I discovered that the vacuum was full, and that's why it kept clocking. Lesson learned. This is usually a really satisfying process and makes for a cool video. Unfortunately, it was ruined by all of the stopping, so I faked it by covering the whole sign with chips and making my own oddly satisfying video. The last machining process is to cut the sign out. Whenever I cut something out, I always set my Z0 to the waste board. That way, if I don't have the material thickness perfectly measured, I don't end up removing too much material and digging really deep into the waste board, or not enough and having to run the toolpath again. I used a 1/8 inch spiral upcut bit for this. I left a couple small tabs to hold everything in place. These oscillating multi-tools make quick work of the tabs. Because I didn't go the full depth of the sign with the epoxy border, you can still see some of the MDF backing. To take care of this, I just put a heavy chamfer on the backside. This will also clean off the rest of the material left from the tabs. I used a 1/8 inch round over bit on the top just to break the edge, and sand everything smooth with 120 grit. Before flood coating everything with epoxy, make sure you come back with some paper towels and solvent to clean everything off. The flood coat is a bit messy, so I make sure I lay down plastic to catch any drips. I let the epoxy run right off the edge. You might have noticed the white lines around the red and blue epoxy. If I hadn't filled the entire area with epoxy, these lines would be MDF and would look terrible. If you don't want any line, you can slightly grow the border of the pockets, but in this case, I think it makes everything stand out and look cleaner. This sign only took me 3 days to make, and the third day was just a bit of cleanup. The best way I've found to get these drips off is with a heat gun and chisel. Once the epoxy gets a little warm, they come right off. While it was upside down, I cut a keyhole so I can hang this. You can do a long slot with a couple holes like I did, or 2 individual slots. If this sign was for a customer, I'd probably seal the back, but I'm not too worried about it. As always, thank you all so much for watching. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments section below. It also really helps me out if you leave a comment saying what you thought of the project and share it with your friends. One final public service announcement. I decided to start a new YouTube channel to help keep stuff organized. I'll be keeping everything CNC, laser, and 3D printing related on this channel, while doing bigger woodworking and metalworking projects on my other channel. I'll put a link to that in the description. I appreciate everyone's support, and we'll see everyone over on one of these other videos.